My name is Jack Zhang. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas, and I also direct the KU Trade War Lab.
Why is it important that Xi Jinping is visiting the United States right now?
Yeah, I mean, short answer is it's long overdue, right? Since the end of the Cold War, I believe we've had a U.S. Chinese head of state visit about every 2 years or so. But the last time the Chinese head of state, President Xi, was in the U.S., I believe, was 2017 in Florida. So that was 6 years ago, right? And these past 6 years have been some of the worst, most tumultuous, intense, conflict sort of filled years of U.S. China relations since normalization. So you have mounting strategic competition that really started with the Trump trade war. These tariffs are still in place, and I'll return to that later. Right, that was 2018. Then, just as we thought, maybe the trade war is coming to an end, 2020 COVID hits, mutual recrimination, finger pointing, a lot of acrimony, and then quickly after the Biden administration coming in, I think some of us were hoping that maybe tensions will cool, but instead, actually, we've seen a ramping up of economic competition, really deepening of this trade war into the tech war, into something like tech containment, right, and multilateral pressure. And so things are bad in U.S. China relations. Public opinion is worse than ever. Public opinion, I think, in the U.S. of China is 83% unfavorable. In China, I think it's like 75% unfavorable towards the U.S. So pretty bad. And so in this context, right, I think it's really promising and important that both sides, the leaders of both sides, see, the need for putting guardrails on the what I think is the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world, right? To identify some mutual areas of cooperation, mutual interests, and maybe to, if we can hope, right, to de-escalate somewhat and maybe bring about a reset of the relationship, although I'm not so optimistic there. Just to throw in an analogy, I always, the rivalries and competition, I don't think have to be destructive. I'm a college basketball fan, and I hope for U.S. China relations to be more like the Duke UNC rivalry and competition, right, where it's passionate, it's intense, the real stakes, right, but it's not an existential war for survival. It's not a you win, I lose. I mean, in the game it is, right, but it's not no competitions, no prisoners type of taken type of competition where we go burn down each other's stadiums or something like that. Instead, that rivalry pushes each team to be better. So I hope, I don't think we can avoid U.S. China competition moving forwards. Some of that competition could even be healthy, but I hope that this kind of this meeting will be a small step towards making that competition constructive rather than sort of destructive and destabilizing.
What issues will be brought up during the summit?
Well, as you may know, Lawrence, Kansas is very far from Washington, D.C., and so I don't have any special insight into this other than just reading the news. But I think there have been, some headlines that hint at what the agenda of the meeting will at least touch on, right? I think there's a round of nuclear arms control talks that's been happening in the background that probably will be on the agenda, and this is timely and important for the U.S. Right, the U.S. is now entangled in two conflicts that involve nuclear powers. Right, the war in Europe with after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now the Israel-Hamas war, but with Iran and worrying kind of skirmishes between U.S. forces and Iranian proxies, right? So I think the last thing that the U.S. wants, or the Biden administration wants, is crisis involving another nuclear power, be that China or North Korea, and so rehashing, and also bad for the world economy. So any progress on arms control, especially as Russia is pulling out of some of these Cold War era agreements, would be beneficial. And so it's nice to see the U.S. and China potentially addressing that. Related to that a little bit is, I think, the hope that military to military dialogues will resume after being frozen since the trade war, and controlling for making sure that accidents don't happen, in tensions in the South China Sea has also been headlines again this past couple of weeks. Turning next to a different subject, climate is almost certainly going to be on the agenda. I think John Kerry had productive talks with his Chinese counterpart, and it looks like the U.S. and China are trying to at least get on the same page ahead of the COP28 summit. So I'm sure there'll be some nod, especially if this is in California, it's in San Francisco. I think there'll be a nod to climate change and green technology there. I would assume that law enforcement will also be on the agenda, particularly from the U.S. side. The ask is that China help limit fentanyl precursor chemicals from coming to the U.S. The Biden administration, I think, either announced or have already implemented some sanctions against Chinese firms that are involved in, identified to be involved in this kind of trade. But maybe that carrot and stick sort of approach on this issue, which is, very devastated U.S. communities and is high up on the agenda for Congress, will be touched on here. I would guess now, just more and more speculative, right? I would venture to guess that U.S. asks will also include, calls for China to pressure Russia to end the war in Ukraine, to call on Iran, maybe for restraint, to share, intelligence perhaps vis-a-vis North Korea. Those are issues of concern on national security for the U.S. and areas where China has some leverage. And on the other hand, China probably will be concerned and ask about sort of U.S. stance reaffirmation, maybe of the one China policy on Taiwan ahead of these elections that are due in Taiwan in January of next year. Another area that China probably will push the U.S. is for clarity about what de-risking is and decoupling, right? The Biden administration has said that it's trying to pursue de-risking, not decoupling, and not containment of China. But a lot of the instruments are the same in those categories. And as I mentioned before, right, the tariffs that the Trump administration have put into place are still in place, and consumers and businesses and producers in both countries are paying the costs for that. And so, maybe that's probably too optimistic. I doubt heading into an election here in the U.S. that there'll be substantive movement there, but at least some clarity about the aims and extent of some of these economic statecraft variables would be discussed. And then finally, I think more closely aligned to what the National Committee has been calling for, like people-to-people exchange have been moribund since the pandemic. And flights are still really limited between the U.S. and China, direct flights. A lot of academic programs are on ice. Visas are a source of uncertainty. And so all of those things I imagine could be part of, would be productive parts of the agenda.
What are shared goals between the United States and China?
Yeah, I think there are many fundamental goals that the U.S. and China share in common. First is peace, or avoiding war, to be more specific, right? I mean, if you read the headlines these days, it feels like we're heading towards like a World War III type of scenario sometimes, right? And so, avoiding a direct U.S.-China confrontation would definitely be the interest of to both countries. Both are nuclear powers, the first and second largest economy in the world, would be devastating on all levels, right? So definitely avoiding that. And beyond that, putting an end to wars in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Africa, where both the U.S. and China have economic interests. Those peace in those circumstances will serve the interest in both nations, and also the welfare of the people who are caught in the middle of those conflicts. So first is peace. Second is economic development, I think, right? Growth. This is used to be a ballast in the U.S.-China relationship. And in particular, I think maybe there's room for cooperation in that, I personally believe that one of the causes of the trade war was overconfidence by either side, that they were going to be less hurt by the measures that they were putting into place to coerce the other side. But it turns out, right, the trade war is just really destructive for both economies. And right now, in particular, the Chinese economy in the past couple of quarters is really struggling, right? Unemployment is high, maybe higher than the official numbers even suggest. Companies are in default. Major sectors of the economy tied to real estate are, long-term sort of engine of Chinese domestic growth is slowing down and has big problems. Foreign direct investment going into China are at the lowest levels since I remember. So all these are pressures that may increase the appetite for cooperation. That would be good. The U.S. economy looks better off in the short run, at least, but I think if we're looking at it seriously, we have to acknowledge the serious structural problems, especially with the debt. Right, in the U.S., I think debt servicing is now in the range of $1 trillion or something like that a year. It's insane, and so the long acknowledged structural imbalances between the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy. We've been talking about this for like a decade. As long as I've been following this issue, right? There are common interests in resolving some of these imbalances, in particular, excess savings and investment in China, excess debt in the United States, and consumption, debt-fueled sort of consumption. I think a trade war was a distraction from all of that, right? It's not a macroeconomic fix that addresses some of these things, and actually, I think it exacerbates these problems. So, moving towards, again, finding rooms for cooperation on economic growth, maybe structural reforms even, would be really important. Climate change, of course, both governments acknowledge this is a serious problem. Both governments want to move towards greener technologies, more sustainable economies. How to implement and cooperate, I'll defer to. You guys had a really good series recently with Michael Davidson, a friend of mine. So check that out for climate at APEC. So I won't talk more about that. And lastly, I think, science and technology development, which was like one of the early areas of cooperation between the U.S. and China, has really been frayed since the onset of the trade war, and especially during the pandemic, right? Mutual suspicions of researchers and fear of sort of secrets, data security, or business secrets, flowing in and out. So on two areas here related to science and technology, I mean, one is just on regulation, right? So even if both U.S. and China want to be leaders in, the technologies of the future, that's understandable. That still requires, in a global economy, to have common standards when it comes to AI or EV or robotics or genetics or mRNA vaccines, right? Cryptocurrency, what have you, space exploration. All of those require, and countries will benefit from having converging on certain, same standards for mundane things like what size charger you want to use for EVs, right? If we converge on one standard, it's much better. So that's certainly an area. But then the other side of the science and technology question is, as I hinted earlier, is the education and the collaboration bit, which has really suffered, right? I mean, the National Committee's done really good work on this, highlighting this. I mean, the China Initiative was a disaster for Chinese Americans like myself, but especially working in STEM in the U.S., right? And what China has been doing with the espionage law and campaign real puts a damper on, there's many fewer already expat researchers and workers in China, but I imagine there will be many fewer. This kinds of policies that discourage collaboration by research institutions, by universities like mine. So I hope that, some high-level sort of government mandate will create the room for some of these.
What can both leaders do during the summit to improve the U.S. China relationship?
Yeah, I mean, we just talked about a lot, and I don't want to. Time is limited, and I don't think they'll be able to get through and solve all of these problems. But I think the important thing is that having high-level meetings face to face like this sets the tone for bilateral relations for the whole bureaucracy of state, and I think creates political space, right? Then for lower units and even non-state actors to kind of coordinate upon, right? Empowering lower level officials who substantively know the issues and can solve some stuff and identify, that they probably know areas where cooperation would be good, right? And there's probably thousands of these, but that are frozen, particularly I think on the Chinese side, right? Given the political climate that's resulted from the trade war and the drive towards technological self-sufficiency and the siege kind of mentality, it's really hard, I think, for initiative that used to be common from Chinese provinces or ministries to seek cooperation on substantive technical issues that I think would be both beneficial to both China and the U.S. Let's take education, for example. I think I've heard anecdotally from colleagues that there's been, kind of a schizophrenic reaction among Chinese partners about education exchange, because it's just not clear whether it's going to get you in trouble or, as it's been in the past, it's been a good thing and can get you promoted, right? So I think having the political space created by the top leaders of both countries, again, more influential, I think, in China than in the U.S., will hopefully solve some of those expectations problems lower down in government. Then there's like low-hanging fruits, so maybe they can probably have already negotiated some areas of things that they can announce afterwards as achievements. So I don't know, you guys probably have more insights on the National Committee side on what some of these might be. I could suspect on flights, for example, right? That's an easy one, relatively easier one for the two governments to solve, and allowing sort of more direct flights. Again, law enforcement on drugs, I think, should be a no-brainer, right? That I hope that the Chinese sides, which has its own and historically has cooperated with the DEA on drug interdiction and has very strict laws on drug use domestically, to also be sympathetic to the problem that fentanyl is causing in the United States, and and intervene to prevent these precursor chemicals from contributing to that problem. Another one is improved business climate. I think is a not easy one, but like a low-hanging fruit, relatively speaking, in that historically both countries have welcomed investors from the other country, and in the past couple of years, that's not been the case. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of sense that foreign businesses are being unfairly treated, just whether they're welcome sort of at all. There's a list of all more concrete sort of actions that are taken that our friends at U.S. China Business Council and AmCham have put together. Whether these get top level attention, I mean, this is even acknowledging some of these issues, I think would go a long way in helping them get resolved. This is by no means a low-hanging fruit, but I'm biased because of what I work on. But tariffs, I think, should be a low-hanging fruit. I mean, these are Trump-era tariffs that I would encourage the Biden administration to let go of. The economic analysis is very clear. They're self-defeating, they're dead weight loss. If they are creating jobs, they're at tremendous expense here in the US. And so they're just making supply chains worse. It's a chance for the Biden administration, I think, to differentiate itself from the Trump, the likely race with President Trump, because I don't think you can out-tariff the tariff man. And so explaining to the American people why trade barriers of this sort is not necessarily to the benefit of the American public, I think is a thing that I hope the administration can do. I am skeptical whether that opinion is held by people in the administration. But yeah, so low-hanging fruits and creating some political space in a short couple of hours of meeting time, if that, would be a lot to ask for after all 6 long years of waiting.